The old cabin sat high in the valley where the Rocky Mountains touched the sky. Evening light poured like honey across the wooden porch where two figures sat in silence. One was young, barely 18, with the restless energy of a man about to leave everything he knew. The other was old, 74 years weathered by time and trial, his white hair catching the last rays of the dying sun. Thomas Thornwood watched his grandfather stare out at the mountains. Tomorrow he would board a train to Denver, then on to Chicago for university. It would be the first time in his life he had left these peaks, this valley, this family that had raised him. "Grandpa," Thomas said, his voice uncertain, "I am not sure I am doing the right thing. Leaving here, leaving everyone. What if I become someone I do not recognize? What if I forget who I am?" Silas Thornwood did not answer immediately. That was his way. He never spoke without thinking, never wasted words on empty comfort. When he finally turned to look at his grandson, his eyes were sharp despite his age, eyes that had seen war and death and love and loss. "You want to know how to keep yourself from getting lost out there?" Silas said. It was not a question. Thomas nodded. "Then let me tell you a story. Not the kind they put in books, but the kind that teaches you something true about what a man is made of." Silas shifted in his chair, his gaze drifting back to the mountains. 52 years ago, in the winter of 1873, I found a woman dying in the snow. The choice I made that day changed everything. Not just my life, but what I believed about myself." Thomas leaned forward. His grandfather rarely spoke of the past. The family knew fragments. They knew he had fought in the Civil War. They knew he had lost a wife and children before coming west. They knew that Grandma Margaret, the tall and formidable woman who had raised 12 orphans in this valley, had met him under unusual circumstances. But they did not know the whole story. "What happened?" Thomas asked. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he began. "It started on a February evening when the sky was the color of a fresh bruise and the wind cut through the plains like a blade made of ice. The cold was a living thing that winter. It crept through layers of fur and wool, found every gap in clothing settled into bones like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. Silas Thornwood had lived in these mountains for 12 years, and still the cold could surprise him with its cruelty. He was checking his trap line along Willow Creek when he saw the blood. At first he thought it was from an animal, a wounded elk perhaps, or a deer that had tangled with a mountain lion. But as he knelt to examine the dark stains on the white snow, his experienced eyes told him different. This blood did not spray or splatter the way animal blood did. It pooled and smeared, leaving a trail that stretched back toward the eastern ridge. The trail of someone crawling, dragging themselves through the frozen wilderness. Human blood, and a lot of it. Silas checked his hawk and rifle. The weapon had been with him since the war, had saved his life more times than he could count. His hand found the familiar weight of the stock, the cold metal of the barrel. Whatever had happened here, whatever waited at the end of that blood trail, he would face it prepared. He followed the crimson path through the snow, moving with the silence that 12 years in the wilderness had taught him. His footsteps made no sound on the frozen crust. His breath came slow and controlled, making only the smallest clouds of vapor in the frigid air. The trail led him to a massive fallen pine, its trunk wider than a wagon wheel. And there, slumped against the bark like a discarded puppet, was a shape that made him stop dead in his tracks. At first glance, he thought it was a man. The figure was too large to be a woman, surely. Shoulders broad as any ranch hand legs that stretched out impossibly long across the snow. But as he moved closer, rifle raised, the truth revealed itself in a way that defied everything he expected. It was a woman wearing the black robes of a nun now torn and soaked with blood. She was taller than any female he had ever seen, perhaps 6 feet and 2 inches if she stood. Her dark hair spilled across the snow like ink on parchment, tangled with ice, encrusted with frozen blood. An arrow shaft protruded from her side, broken off near the wound. The blood around it had frozen into a grotesque flower of red ice. Silas stood over her, heart pounding against his ribs. Everything in him, every instinct that had kept him alive through war and wilderness, screamed at him to walk away. This was not his concern. A nun attacked in these mountains meant trouble. It meant questions, investigations, people coming to his valley and disrupting the solitude he had built. For 12 years he had avoided the world of men. He had chosen isolation over connection, safety over involvement. He had watched the seasons turn from his cabin window content to let the rest of humanity continue without him. Then he saw her chest rise, shallow, barely perceptible, but there, she was alive. And in that moment, standing in the blood-soaked snow with the wind howling around him, Silas Thornwood thought of a farmhouse in Missouri. He thought of flames against a night sky. He thought of arriving too late, finding only ashes and 3 graves where his family had been. For 15 years, that failure had eaten at him like a cancer of the soul. Damn it all, he muttered through clenched teeth. He knelt beside the woman and examined the wound with practiced hands. The arrow had entered at an angle, piercing the flesh of her side, but missing as far as he could tell anything vital. She had lost blood, but not enough to kill her outright. The cold had slowed her heart, kept her from bleeding out. It had also nearly frozen her to death. He broke off the remaining shaft of the arrow, careful not to push it deeper. The woman groaned, her massive frame shuddering with pain, even in unconsciousness. Getting her onto his horse was one of the hardest physical tasks Silas had ever attempted. She weighed at least 170 pounds, all of it dead weight. His aging Mustang Blackfoot snorted and pranced in protest at the burden. "Easy, old friend," Silas whispered, stroking the horse's neck. "Just 2 miles, you can make it." He lashed her to the saddle with leather straps, ensuring she would not fall during the journey. Every step of the way back to his cabin, he scanned the tree line, watched for movement, listened for the sounds of pursuit. Someone had shot this woman. That someone might still be hunting her. The cabin sat in a narrow valley shielded by high rock walls on 3 sides and dense pine forest on the 4th. Silas had chosen this location deliberately 12 years ago. It was defensible, hidden, nearly impossible to find unless you knew exactly where to look. He had rigged the approaches with warning systems learned from years of frontier living. Thin wires connected to bells inside. Disturbed ground that would collapse under weight. Carefully arranged branches that could not be moved without leaving obvious signs. Inside, the single room was small but solid. Walls of pine logs more than a foot thick kept out the worst of the winter cold. A stone fireplace dominated one corner, flames crackling steadily against the darkness. The bed was simple, a wooden frame with a mattress of dried grass and blankets of bear fur. The woman barely fit on it. Her legs hung over the edge, her shoulders pressed against both sides. Even unconscious, even wounded and near death, she filled the space with a presence that seemed almost mythical. Silas worked through the night. He cut away the frozen black robes around the wound, revealing pale skin marred by the ugly entry point of the arrow. The shaft had gone deep, but his probing fingers found no damage to organs. A lucky angle, an inch in either direction, and she would have been dead within hours. He cleaned the wound with whiskey, the only disinfectant he had. He stitched the torn flesh with needle and thread made from deer sinew, the same technique he had used on himself half a dozen times over the years. He packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow root and sage leaves, medicines he had learned from a Ute medicine woman named Spotted Owl, who lived in the high country and had become something like a friend over the years. The fever came at midnight. Her body burned like a furnace, fighting the infection that had already begun to spread. She thrashed and moaned, speaking words he could not understand. Some sounded like Latin, the language of Catholic prayers. Others were clearly English names and pleas that painted a picture of terror and desperation. "Father, please, they know who I am." Silas sat beside her bed, changing the coal cloths on her forehead, feeding the fire to keep the cabin warm. He did not pray. He had stopped believing in anything beyond his own 2 hands years ago. But he hoped. He hoped with an intensity that surprised him. He hoped she would live. Toward dawn, the fever broke, and the woman opened her eyes. The eyes that met his were the gray blue of storm clouds over mountain peaks. Sharp, alert, dangerous. In the span of a single heartbeat, they swept the cabin, assessed the exits, cataloged potential weapons. These were not the eyes of a helpless victim. They were the eyes of someone who had learned to survive. She moved before he could react. Despite her wound, despite hours of fever and blood loss, she surged upward from the bed with a speed that defied reason. Her hands shot toward the bedside table, searching for something to use as a weapon. "Easy," Silas said, holding up both hands to show he was unarmed. "You are safe. I found you into the snow, stitched to your wound. You almost died." She froze, half sitting, her massive frame tense like a coiled spring, her eyes locked onto his, measuring him, judging him. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of wind outside. Who are you? Her voice was deeper than he expected, carrying an authority that filled the small cabin. Silas Thornwood. I live here. Why did you save me? Silas lowered his hands slowly. He walked to the fireplace, poured warm water from a kettle into a wooden bowl, and set it within her reach. Drink. You lost a lot of blood. She did not touch the water. I asked you a question. Because leaving you to die out there is not something a decent man does. Her gaze held his for a long moment. Then slowly she reached for the bowl and drank. When she finished, she set it aside and touched her bandaged wound with careful fingers. You should have let me die, she said finally. Not an accusation, a statement of fact. My people will come looking. When they find me here, they will have questions. Questions that could get you killed. I know. And yet you saved me anyway. Silas turned back to the fire, adding another log to the flames. I have been dead inside for 15 years, sister. What happens to my body matters less than you might think. Her name was Margaret Hayes, Sister Margaret Hayes of the Sisters of Charity in Denver. But that was only part of her identity. She was also the daughter of Judge Ezekiel Hayes, one of the most powerful federal judges in Colorado Territory. A man who had sentenced dozens of outlaws to hang, who had made enemies in every corner of the frontier. A man whose daughter would be worth a fortune in ransom. They were not ordinary bandits, Margaret said, her voice hardening as she recounted the attack. They knew my name before I spoke it. They knew which wagon I was in, which route we were taking to the mountain chapel. They were waiting for us. Silas listened without interrupting. He had pulled a chair to a safe distance from the bed, giving her space while remaining close enough to hear every word. How many of 4? They killed the driver first, then Sister Agnes. Her jaw tightened. She was 63 years old. She never harmed anyone in her life. And you? They tried to take me, drag me off the wagon. A ghost of something flickered across her face. They did not expect me to fight back. Silas studied her, the breadth of her shoulders, the calluses on her hands that he had noticed while treating her wound, the way she moved, even injured, with a controlled power that spoke of training. You were taught to defend yourself. My father insisted. He said the daughter of a judge in frontier territory needed to know how to survive. She looked down at her large hands. He wanted a son, got me instead. I think teaching me to fight was his way of making peace with that. What happened to the men who attacked you? I broke one man's nose with my fist, kicked another hard enough to crack his ribs, took a knife from the third and put it through his shoulder. She touched her bandaged side. The fourth one panicked, shot me with an arrow and ran. You fought off 4 armed men. I am not an ordinary woman, Mr. Thornwood, in case you had not noticed. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Silas felt the corners of his mouth twitch toward a smile. I noticed. There is something else, Margaret said, her voice dropping lower. Something I have been piecing together since the attack. Silas leaned forward slightly. The man who shot me. Before he ran, he said something. He said the Reverend was right. She is too dangerous. He mentioned a name. What name? Crane. Reverend Josiah Crane. The name meant nothing to Silas. He had avoided the towns and settlements for over a decade, had no knowledge of local clergy or community leaders. He is a minister in Silver Creek, Margaret continued. He came to our convent twice in the past month, asked about my travel schedule, said he wanted to prepare a proper welcome at the mountain chapel. Her eyes hardened. I did not suspect him. Why would I? He was a man of good. You think he organized the kidnapping? I think he is the mastermind. He had access, information, and trust. She shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at her wound. And now that I have escaped, he will know I can identify the connection. Silas processed this information. A corrupt minister, a kidnapping plot targeting a judge's daughter, men who killed without hesitation. This was far more dangerous than a simple robbery gone wrong. Your father needs to know, he said. Yes, but how Crane likely has people watching the roads. Anyone who tries to reach my father might be intercepted. Silas stood, walked to the small window, and looked out at the snow-covered valley. The world outside was white and silent, deceptively peaceful. I know paths through these mountains that no one else knows. ways to reach Denver without touching a single road or passing through any settlement. That is a 5-day journey at least. I can make it in 4 if the weather holds. Margaret studied him. You would do that, risk your life for a woman you met hours ago. Silas turned back to face her. I spent 15 years running from the world's sister, hiding in these mountains because I could not face what I had lost. Maybe it is time I stopped running. Why now? Why me? The question hung in the air between them. Silas was silent for a long moment. Because 15 years ago, I was not there when my family needed me. My wife, my children. They died while I was away, and I have carried that failure every day since. He met her gaze, so when I saw you in the snow bleeding and dying, I could have walked away. No one would have known, but I would have known, and I cannot be that man anymore. The next morning brought danger closer. Silas left the cabin before dawn to check the perimeter. What he found made his blood run cold. Tracks. 3 riders on horseback passing through the valley less than a mile from the cabin. They were moving in a search pattern, spreading out to cover more ground, looking for something. Looking for someone. He studied the tracks with the careful eye of a man who had survived by reading such signs. The horses were shod, meaning white men, not natives. The spacing between prints suggested they were moving slowly, examining the terrain. One horse carried more weight than the others, probably laden with supplies for an extended search. They had not found the cabin yet. The natural terrain provided concealment, and his years of careful living had left few obvious trails. But they were getting closer. At this rate, they would discover him within a day or 2. Silas returned to find Margaret awake and sitting up, her face pale but determined. They are out there, he said without preamble. 3 men searching. They have not found this place yet, but they will. Margaret's jaw tightened. Then I need to leave. I will not bring death to your door. You would not make it 5 miles in your condition. I can try by and die in the snow. Then your father never learns the truth. Crane goes free, and the men who killed Sister Agnes faced no justice. She fell silent, unable to argue with his logic. Silas made his decision. I will leave tonight, travel through the mountains to Denver. I have a friend, a blacksmith named Thomas Burke, who can get a message to your father without anyone knowing. And me? You stay here. There is a hidden cellar beneath the floor under the rug near the fireplace. If anyone comes, you hide there, and do not come out until you hear my voice. He crossed to a drawer beneath the bed and retrieved a Colt revolver along with a box of ammunition. He placed them within her reach. Can you shoot? My father taught me from the age of 10. Then you can defend yourself if it comes to that. He paused. But it will not. I will be back before they find this place. Before leaving, Silas had one more task. He went to a small wooden box near his bed and retrieved a strip of leather with a tiny brass bell attached. He stepped outside and whistled 3 times in a specific pattern. Minutes later, a red-tailed hawk descended from the pine trees and landed on his outstretched arm. Fine spotted owl, he said quietly to the bird, attaching the bell to its leg. The hawk knew the way. He had trained it years ago, and the Ute medicine woman would recognize the signal. Tell her to come check on the cabin if I am gone more than 4 days. The hawk launched itself into the gray sky and disappeared over the ridge. Margaret watched from the doorway. You have friends in these mountains, after all. 1 or 2, Spotted Owl is a Ute healer. She taught me the medicine I used on your wound. If something happens to me, she will know to come. And if something happens before she arrives, Silas pulled on his heavy coat, checked his rifle, and shouldered a pack of supplies. Then use that cellar. And use that gun. He was halfway to the door when her voice stopped him. Thornwood. He turned. Thank you. Whatever happens, thank you. He nodded once, then stepped out into the bitter cold. The mountain paths that Silas traveled were not on any map. They wound through canyons and over ridges that seemed impassable to anyone who did not know them intimately. He moved through the darkness like a ghost, his footsteps silent on the frozen ground, his senses alert to every sound and shadow. By the second day, he knew he was being followed. The signs were subtle, a disturbed branch here, the distant sound of a horse's whinny there. Whoever was tracking him was good, but not good enough to escape detection by a man who had lived as prey and predator for over a decade. 3 men. He confirmed the number by doubling back and observing from a concealed position on a high ridge. They were following his trail, moving carefully, rifles ready. These were not casual travelers. These were hunters. He had two choices: evade them and hope to outrun their pursuit to Denver, or eliminate them and remove the threat entirely. Silas was not a young man anymore. At 52, his body carried the accumulated damage of war and hard living. A long chase through the mountains in winter could end badly. He chose elimination. The narrow canyon was perfect for what he had in mind. High walls on either side, only one way in and one way out. He had used this place for trapping before knew every boulder and crevice. He positioned himself on a ledge 30 feet above the canyon floor, concealed behind a tumble of rocks that provided both cover and a clear line of fire. Then he waited. They came in single file, the lead rider ducking slightly to pass beneath a low overhang. Silas let him enter the killing ground, let the second rider follow, waited until all three were committed to the narrow passage. Then he fired. The Hawken rifle roared, the sound echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. The first rider pitched backward off his horse dead before he hit the ground. The other two shouted in confusion, horses rearing and screaming. In the chaos, Silas was already moving, sliding down the rock face with a speed that belied his age. He had no time to reload the single-shot rifle. The knife would have to do. The second man was trying to control his panicked horse when Silas reached him. A slash across the hamstring brought him down, a thrust to the throat finished him. It was brutal, efficient, the killing done without passion or hesitation. The skills of war never forgotten. The third man managed to get off two wild shots before Silas closed the distance. One bullet tugged at his coat sleeve, close enough to feel the wind of its passage. The other went wide, sparking off stone. Then they were grappling, rolling on the snow-covered ground, fighting with the desperate intensity of men who knew only one would walk away. The outlaw was younger, stronger, but Silas had experience and the cold clarity of a man with nothing to lose. His knife found its mark. The man stiffened, gasped, and went still. Silas pushed himself to his feet, breathing hard. His shoulder burned where the bullet had grazed him. Blood seeped through his coat, but he ignored it. He had survived worse. He searched the bodies quickly, looking for anything that might confirm their connection to Crane. In the pocket of the first man, he found a folded paper and instructions written in an educated hand. Find the woman. If she is with anyone, eliminate the witness. Report to the Reverend when done. Silas tucked the paper into his own pocket. Evidence, proof of Crane's involvement. Then he counted the horses. 3 horses for 3 men. But there had been 4 sets of tracks at the beginning. The fourth man had split off somewhere along the way, perhaps to circle around, perhaps to serve as a lookout. Either way, he had likely seen the ambush from a distance, and he would be riding hard for Silver Creeks to report what had happened. Silas did not waste time burying the dead. He took the best of their horses, a strong bay mare, and pushed on toward Denver at the fastest pace the terrain would allow. But he knew the math was not in his favor. The surviving man would reach Crane within a day. Crane would learn that someone was actively protecting Margaret, that his hired killers had failed. He would have to change his plans. If Silas were Crane, what would he do? He would go to Judge Hayes himself, control the narrative before anyone else could, paint the protector as the villain, the rescuer as the kidnapper. By the time Silas reached Denver, the lie would already be established as truth. 4 days to Denver through the mountains. But Crane could take the main road and be there in 2. Silas pushed harder, drove himself and the horse beyond the limits of sense or safety. He traveled through the night, navigated treacherous passes by moonlight, risked death a dozen times on icy trails, where a single misstep meant a plunge into darkness. And still he knew it would not be enough. Miles away in the warmth of a well-appointed study in Denver, Reverend Josiah Crane sat across from Judge Ezekiel Hayes. The judge was a man of 62 years, his white hair and rigid posture speaking to a lifetime of discipline and authority. But his eyes, normally cold and calculating, were raw with fear. His daughter had been missing for 4 days. I came as soon as I heard, Crane said, his voice pitched to convey precisely the right mixture of concern and sorrow. The attack was savage, Judge. The driver and Sister Agnes were killed outright. Of your daughter. He paused, letting the silence do its terrible work. We found blood. A great deal of blood. Hayes gripped the arms of his chair until his knuckles went white. But no body. No, which gives us hope. Crane leaned forward, every inch the compassionate minister. But I must tell you something troubling. We have witnesses who saw a man near the scene of the attack, a mountain man who lives as a hermit in the wilderness. His name is Silas Thornwood. You believe he took her? I believe he was involved somehow, and just yesterday this man killed 3 members of my search party, ambushed them without warning or provocation. Hayes rose from his chair, pacing to the window. Outside, Denver bustled with life, unaware of the drama unfolding in this room. I will gather every man I can find. We will go to these mountains, and we will find my daughter. Of course, Judge, and I will accompany you personally. I know the territory, and I feel responsible for what has happened. Hayes turned back, and for a moment Crane thought he saw suspicion flicker in the old man's eyes. But grief and fear overwhelmed it, and the judge simply nodded. We leave at dawn. Crane rose, bowing his head in a gesture of sympathy. We will find her, Judge. One way or another, we will find her. As he left the study, Crane allowed himself a small smile. The trap was set. Hayes would lead a small army into the mountains following Crane's guidance. They would find the cabin, find Margaret, and in the confusion of the rescue, both she and the mountain man would die. No witnesses, no evidence. A tragedy, but one that would leave Crane free and clear. 3 people separated by miles of frozen mountain wilderness, their fates intertwined by a chance encounter in the snow. A woman who had chosen to fight when she could have surrendered. A man who had chosen to help when he could have walked away. A father who would risk everything to save his child, never knowing that every step he took brought him closer to a trap. The first act of their drama had concluded. The players were in position. The board was set. What came next would determine whether mercy led to redemption or ruin. The old man paused in his telling, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Thomas sat motionless, completely absorbed in the story, the approaching darkness forgotten. So Crane got to Denver first, Thomas said. He turned your great-grandfather against you before you could tell him the truth. Silas nodded slowly. That is the thing about lies, son. They travel faster than truth. A lie does not need evidence or proof. It just needs to arrive first and sound believable. What did you do? What could I do? I was 2 days behind, wounded, exhausted. By the time I reached Denver, your great-grandfather Hayes was already leading 20 armed men into the mountains, with Crane riding right beside him, whispering poison in his ear. Thomas leaned forward. But Grandma was still in the cabin, alone. Not for long. Remember the hawk I sent to Spotted Owl? She received my signal on the 3rd day and came to check on the cabin. A rare smile crossed Silas's face. But your grandmother was never the type to sit and wait for rescue. That was one of the first things I learned about her. 4 days had passed since Silas rode into the frozen wilderness. 4 days of silence, of watching the tree line for movement, of listening to every creak and groan of the cabin walls with her hand on the revolver he had left her. Margaret Hayes was not a woman who accepted helplessness easily. By the 2nd day, she could move without too much pain. By the 3rd, she was exploring the cabin, learning its secrets, understanding the mind of the man who had built this refuge in the wilderness. She found his books first, a small collection worn from repeated reading, philosophy, history, poetry. Not the library of an uneducated hermit, but of a man who had once been something more. She found the letters next bundled in oilcloth at the bottom of a wooden chest. Letters written in a feminine hand addressed to my dearest Silas. She did not read them. Some privacies were sacred, even for the curious. But she found the photographs. 3 images in a small wooden box hidden beneath the bed. A young woman with gentle eyes and a soft smile. 2 children, a boy and a girl, perhaps 5 and 3 years old. The woman held the children on her lap, all 3 looking at the camera with the serious expressions that long exposure times required. His family, the ones he had lost. Margaret replaced the photographs carefully, understanding now why this man had buried himself in the mountains. Understanding the depth of the wound he carried. On the 3rd night, one of the warning bells rang. Margaret was on her feet instantly, revolver in hand, heart pounding. She moved to the small window, peering out into the moonlit darkness. A shape moved through the trees, approaching the cabin. A single figure, on foot, too small to be a man. Margaret waited, finger on the trigger, as the shape emerged from the shadows. An old woman, Native American by her dress and bearing, with white hair braided down her back and a leather satchel over one shoulder. The woman stopped 20 feet from the cabin door and called out in accented but clear English. "Thornwood sent me. I come to check on the tall woman." Margaret did not lower the gun. How do I know he sent you? He said to tell you that a man who saves a stranger is either brave or foolish, and he is probably both. The old woman's voice carried a hint of dry humor. He said you would understand. Margaret remembered those words. She had said something similar to Silas that first morning. She opened the door but kept the revolver visible. Come in, slowly. The old woman entered without fear, her sharp eyes taking in the cabin, the bandaged wound visible through Margaret's torn robes and the weapon in her hand. I am Spotted Owl, she said, medicine woman of the Ute. Thornwood is my friend. He helped my people through a hard winter many years ago. I owe him a debt. What kind of debt? The kind that is repaid with life. Spotted Owl set down her satchel and began unpacking supplies. Fresh herbs, clean bandages, a small pot of something that smelled of pine and mint. He sent word by Hawk 4 days ago. Asked me to come if he was gone too long. Let me see your wound. Margaret hesitated, then lowered the gun and allowed the old woman to examine the stitches Silas had made. Good work, Spotted Owl muttered. He learned well, but infection is trying to start. I have medicine that will help. As the old woman applied her poultice, she spoke of other things, of the riders she had seen in the valleys to the east, of the rumors spreading through the settlements about a kidnapped nun and a dangerous mountain man. Many men coming, Spotted Owl said. Maybe 20, maybe more. They will be here in 2 days. Margaret's blood ran cold. My father, a man with white hair, leads them. Another man in black rides beside him. The one in black. Spotted Owl's weathered face creased with distrust. He has the eyes of a snake. I do not trust men with such eyes. Crane. It had to be Crane. They think Silas kidnapped me, Margaret realized. Crane has convinced my father that the man who saved my life is the one who tried to take it. Then you must show them the truth. How if I stay here, they will find me, and Crane will have me killed in the confusion. If I run, I might not survive the wilderness. Spotted Owl finished applying the poultice and sat back regarding Margaret with ancient knowing eyes. There is a third way, the way of the hunter, not the hunted. Margaret listened as Spotted Owl outlined a strategy born of generations of survival in hostile territory. You do not hide in the cabin like a rabbit in a hole. You do not run like a deer from wolves. You position yourself where you can see them before they see you. When your father comes, you reveal yourself in a way that the snake cannot prevent. Where there is a ridge above the eastern approach, the path all riders must take to reach this valley. From there you can see for miles. When the men come, you show yourself to your father before anyone can stop you. And if Crane tries to have me killed anyway, what proof do I have that he is behind this? Spotted Owl was quiet for a moment. I passed through the canyon 2 days ago. 3 dead men already frozen. Thornwood's work. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. She had known Silas could fight, but hearing confirmation of killing was different. Did you search them? I did. This is what I found. The medicine woman reached into her satchel and produced a leather pouch. Inside were several folded papers stained with old blood and snowmelt. Margaret unfolded the papers with trembling hands, instructions written in a careful, educated hand, details of her travel route, descriptions of the wagon she would be in, and at the bottom a signature she recognized from her visits to the chapel. J. Crane. Evidence, Margaret breathed. This proves he organized the attack. Thornwood must have searched them, but could not stop to take everything. He was being hunted. I found these hidden in a boot. Spotted Owl nodded slowly. Now you have a weapon, not a gun, but something more powerful. Truth. Meanwhile, Silas pushed himself beyond all reasonable limits. He rode through snow and ice, navigating treacherous mountain passes in the dark, driving his stolen horse until it could barely stand. On the morning of the 5th day, he reached the outskirts of Denver, and there he learned the worst. Thomas Burke the blacksmith, who was his only contact with the outside world, met him at the edge of town with fear in his eyes. You are too late, Thomas said. Hayes left yesterday with 20 men. Crane is with him. Silas swore a rare breach of his usual composure. They think I am the kidnapper. Crane told them you killed 3 men from the search party, called you a madman living alone in the wilderness, dangerous and unpredictable. Thomas gripped Silas's arm. You cannot go to them, Silas. They will shoot you on sight. I have to. Margaret is still in that cabin. If Hayes and Crane find her, you said yourself she has a gun. She can defend herself. Against 1 or 2 men, yes. Against 20. Silas shook his head. I have to warn her. Get her out before they arrive. You will never make it in time. They have a full day's head start, and they are not trying to hide their trail. Silas was silent for a moment, thinking. Then his eyes hardened with resolution. I know paths they do not know. I can cut through terrain they cannot cross. If I leave now and do not stop, I might reach the cabin an hour before they do. And then what? Even if you warn her, you will be trapped between them in the wilderness. Then I will figure something out when I get there. Thomas stared at him, seeing something in the older man's face that he had never seen before. Purpose, determination, the look of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. You really are going to die for this woman, are you not? Silas mounted his exhausted horse, then paused. Maybe. Or maybe I am finally going to live for something. I am not sure which anymore. He rode out of town before Thomas could respond, heading back into the mountains, racing against time and fate. The landscape of the Rocky Mountains became a chessboard, with multiple pieces moving toward the same square. From the east came Judge Hayes and his 20 men, following the main trails, guided by Reverend Crane. They moved with the determination of a father desperate to save his child, and the confidence of men who believed they were the heroes of this story. From the south came Silas alone, pushing through passes and canyons that would have stopped any group larger than one. He traveled paths that existed only in his memory, places where the snow lay unmarked by any human foot. And in the hidden valley, Margaret prepared her own gambit. With Spotted Owl's help, she gathered what supplies she could carry. The evidence against Crane, the revolver with its remaining ammunition, enough food and water for a day. Before she left the cabin, she paused at the door, looking back at the small space that had been her refuge. You are a good man, Silas Thornwood, she said to the empty room. Whatever happens, I want you to know that someone saw you clearly. Then she closed the door and followed Spotted Owl into the wilderness. The position Spotted Owl had chosen was perfect. A rocky outcrop high above the eastern approach, hidden from below by scrub pines and tumbled boulders. From here, Margaret could see the entire valley spread out beneath her like a map. The cabin was a small, dark shape against the white snow. The tree line formed a dark border, and the trail that any riders must follow wound through the terrain like a brown ribbon. They will come through there. Spotted Owl pointed to a gap in the ridge line. It is the only way for horses. When you see your father, you reveal yourself. Call to him. Make sure he sees you before the snake can act. And I will be gone before they arrive. My people cannot be involved in white men's quarrels. The old woman touched Margaret's arm. But I will watch from the high places. If the snake wins, if you die, I will make sure the truth reaches someone who can use it. Margaret took the old woman's hand. Thank you for everything. Spotted Owl nodded once, then disappeared into the rocks like a shadow. Margaret settled into her hiding place and waited. They came in the late morning when the sun was high enough to cast short shadows across the snow. 23 men on horseback, their breath and the breath of their horses forming clouds of vapor in the cold air. At the front rode 2 men. One had white hair and sat his horse with the rigid posture of a man accustomed to authority. Even from this distance, Margaret recognized her father. The sight of him sent a wave of emotion through her, relief and fear and love, all tangled together. Beside him rode a man in black, and even without seeing his face clearly, she knew it was Crane, the snake as Spotted Owl had called him, the architect of her suffering. They approached the cabin in a tactical formation, guns drawn clearly expecting resistance. Margaret watched as her father shouted orders as men surrounded the small building from all sides. Then they went in. Even from her elevated position, she could see the confusion when they found the cabin empty. Men emerged shaking their heads. Others searched the area around the building looking for tracks or signs. Crane was speaking rapidly to her father, gesturing toward the mountains. She could not hear the words, but she could imagine them. He escaped. He took her deeper into the wilderness. We must pursue. It was time. Margaret stood rising from her concealment like a spirit emerging from the earth. The morning sun caught her black robes, making her a stark figure against the pale rock. Father, her voice echoed across the valley loud and clear and alive. Every head turned toward her. 23 men stared up at the impossible sight of the woman they had come to rescue, standing alone and unharmed on a ridge above them. Hayes spurred his horse forward, his face a mask of shock and joy and disbelief. But Crane was faster. He grabbed the reins of the judge's horse, stopping him. Wait, it could be a trap. The mountain man might be using her as bait. That is my daughter, and she might have a gun to her head. Let me send men to secure the ridge first. Margaret saw her window closing. She began to descend, picking her way down the rocky slope with as much speed as she dared. Father, listen to me, she called as she climbed down. Reverend Crane is the one who arranged my kidnapping. I have proof he is the one who... A gunshot cracked through the cold air. The bullet struck the rock inches from Margaret's head, sending splinters of stone into her cheek. She ducked, losing her footing, sliding several feet down the slope before catching herself. She is with the kidnapper, Crane shouted. She has been compromised. Stop her before she reaches the men. Silas heard the gunshot from a mile away. He pushed his dying horse into one final burst of speed, cresting the ridge just in time to see chaos erupting in the valley below. Margaret was pinned on the slope, unable to descend without exposing herself to the guns below. Crane was shouting orders, trying to direct men up the ridge to secure her. Hayes was arguing, trying to countermand those orders, but confusion reigned. And in that confusion, Silas saw Crane's hand slip to the revolver at his hip. He saw the minister's eyes fix on Margaret with cold calculation. He saw what was about to happen. Silas raised his Hawken rifle, sighted down the long barrel, and fired. The bullet crossed 500 yards of mountain air and struck Crane's gun hand just as he was drawing his weapon. The minister screamed, his revolver flying from suddenly nerveless fingers, blood spraying across the snow. Every gun in the valley turned toward the new threat. Silas did not try to hide. He rode down the slope in full view, rifle across his saddle, making no hostile moves. His eyes found Hayes. Judge, my name is Silas Thornwood. I am the one who saved your daughter's life. The man blading beside you is the one who tried to take it. Hayes stared at him, confusion and anger and hope all warring on his weathered face. Crane, clutching his wounded hand, shouted through the pain. He is lying. He is the kidnapper. Shoot him. Look at your order, Silas roared back. Ask her who speaks the truth. Hayes turned in his saddle, looking up at Margaret on the ridge. She had resumed her descent, moving faster now, driven by desperation. Margaret, is this true? Yes. Father Silas saved my life. Crane organized the attack on our wagon. I have letters with his signature, ordering my capture. He wanted to ransom me, and when that failed, he wanted me dead. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, no one moved. The valley was frozen in a tableau of pointed guns and held breaths. Then Hayes slowly turned his horse until he faced Crane. Josiah, is this true? Crane straightened, his bloody hand pressed against his chest. The mask of the pious minister had cracked, but it was not entirely gone. Judge, please. The girl has been through a terrible ordeal. She is confused. This man has clearly manipulated her, made her believe. The letters, Father. Margaret had reached the valley floor. She pulled the blood-stained documents from her coat and thrust them toward Hayes. Look, his handwriting, his signature, instructions for my kidnapping. Hayes took the papers with trembling hands. He read them once, twice, his face growing darker with each line. When he looked up at Crane, his eyes were the cold, merciless eyes of a judge who had sentenced men to death. Arrest him. Crane knew he was finished. The evidence was damning, his wound was bleeding badly, and 20 men who had trusted him now looked at him with dawning horror and rage. But Josiah Crane had not survived 2 decades as a con man by accepting defeat gracefully. While everyone's attention was on Hayes and the damning letters, Crane moved. He grabbed Deputy Samuel Webb, the young man closest to him, and pressed the knife he had hidden in his boot against Webb's throat. Everyone back, drop your weapons or I open his throat. Webb, the man Crane had secretly bribed to ensure Margaret's death during the rescue, now found himself a hostage to the same desperation. His eyes went wide with terror. You do not want to do this, Crane, Hayes said, his voice steady despite the chaos. What I want is a horse and a clear path out of this valley. Give me that and the boy lives. Father, we cannot let him go. Margaret stepped forward. He has killed before. There are other victims, other families who deserve justice. One more step and I cut. Crane pressed the knife harder, drawing a thin line of blood on Webb's neck. I mean it, girl. You have already cost me everything. Do not make me add another body to the count. The standoff held for several agonizing seconds. Then Silas spoke, his voice calm and carrying in the cold air. Webb, Deputy Webb, look at me. The young deputy's terrified eyes swung toward the mountain man. The man holding that knife paid you to betray your oath. He told you to make sure Margaret died during the rescue. Did he not? Webb's face went white. His guilt was written there for all to see. He was going to make you a murderer, Silas continued, but he is not going to let you live either. You are a loose end. The moment he does not need you as a hostage, he will kill you to keep you silent. Shut up, Crane shouted. Shut your mouth, or I— You can still choose, Silas said, ignoring Crane completely. You can be a victim, or you can be a man, but you have to choose now. Webb was shaking, his whole body trembling with fear and guilt and the desperate need for a way out of the nightmare he had created for himself. Then, with a strangled cry, he drove his elbow back into Crane's stomach. It was not a hard blow. Webb was no fighter and his position was awkward, but it was enough to create a gap between the knife and his throat. Enough for him to twist away, enough for Silas to act. The mountain man covered the distance between himself and Crane in 3 running strides. The minister tried to turn the knife toward this new threat, but Silas caught his wrist twisted and the blade fell to the snow. What followed was brief and brutal. Silas struck Crane twice, once in the stomach to double him over, once across the jaw to send him sprawling. Then he stood over the fallen minister, breathing hard, fists still clenched. That is for the woman you murdered in the wagon. For Sister Agnes, who never hurt anyone. For every other victim you left in your trail of lies. Crane lay in the snow, bleeding from his hand and his mouth finely beaten. Men rushed forward to bind him, to haul him to his feet, to drag him away. When Crane was finally secured and the chaos had settled into something resembling order, Hayes approached his daughter. They stood facing each other, these two people who had argued and disagreed and disappointed each other for so many years. He, the judge who had wanted a son and gotten a daughter. She, the woman who had chosen the convent over the life her father had planned for her. Margaret, his voice cracked on her name. Father. I thought, when Crane told me about the blood, the attack, I thought I had lost you. You almost did, but not because of Silas Thornwood. Hayes looked across the valley to where Silas stood alone, watching them with an unreadable expression. He saved your life. He did more than that. He gave me hope when I had none. He risked everything for a stranger for no reason, except that it was the right thing to do. Hayes was silent for a long moment. Then he walked towards Silas and Margaret followed. They stood facing each other, the judge and the mountain man, 2 men from different worlds brought together by circumstance and choice. I owe you my daughter's life, Hayes said, and I owe you an apology. I believe Crane's lies. I was ready to have you killed. You believed what any father would believe when he thought his child was in danger. That does not excuse the injustice. I am a judge. I am supposed to weigh evidence, not act on emotion. Hayes extended his hand. I am in your debt, Mr. Thornwood. Name your price, and it is yours. Silas looked at the offered hand, then at Margaret, then back at Hayes. I did not save her for a reward. I know. That is why you deserve one. After a moment, Silas shook the judge's hand. There is nothing I want, just to go back to my valley and live in peace. Then at least let me give you this. Hayes reached into his coat and produced a folded document. Legal title to the land where you have been living. I had it drawn up before we left Denver in case I needed to negotiate with a kidnapper. I want you to have it now as thanks from a grateful father. Silas took the document, slowly unfolding it to read the contents. His name, his valley, legal ownership registered with the territorial government. For 12 years, he had lived as a squatter on that land, always aware that someone could come and claim it, drive him out, take away the only home he had known since the war. Now it was his, truly legally, permanently his. I do not know what to say. Say you will use it well. Build something there. Do not let that beautiful land go to waste. Silas looked at Margaret. She was watching him with an expression he could not quite read, but there was something warm in her gray-blue eyes. I will try, he said. The journey back to Denver took 3 days. Crane was bound and guarded every moment, his fate already decided in the minds of the men who had once trusted him. He would face trial for kidnapping, murder, and conspiracy. he would hang. Deputy Webb wrote in a different kind of bondage, the chains of guilt and shame. He had confessed everything, how Crane had paid his gambling debts in exchange for his cooperation, how he was supposed to ensure Margaret died during the rescue. He too would face justice, though perhaps not the gallows. Margaret rode beside her father, speaking little but communicating much through glances and small gestures. The distance that had grown between them over years of disagreement was beginning to close. And Silas rode at the rear of the column alone, and as he had always been, but somehow less alone than before. On the second night, Margaret found him sitting apart from the others, staring up at the stars. "May I join you?" He nodded without speaking, and she settled onto a nearby rock. "You will be leaving soon," she said. "Going back to your valley." "Yes." "Will you miss any of this? The company?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "I have not kept company in a long time. I had forgotten what it was like." And now he looked at her. In the starlight, her face was pale and strong and somehow vulnerable. She was unlike any woman he had ever known. "Now I am remembering." They sat in silence for a while, two people on the edge of something neither quite understood. "I will be returning to the convent," Margaret said finally. "There is work to do there. People who need help." "Is that what you want?" The question surprised her. "It is what I know, what I am good at." "That is not the same thing." Margaret looked down at her hands, the large, strong hands that had always made her feel out of place in the gentle world of the convent. "What do you think I should want?" "I cannot tell you that. Only you know your own heart." Silas stood brushing snow from his coat. "But I can tell you this, my valley is large, large enough for more than one person if someone wanted to see what that life was like. The door would always be open." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her alone with the stars and the question he had planted in her mind. They reached Denver on the third day. Crane was taken to the jail to await trial. Webb was placed under arrest pending charges. Hayes began the complex work of justice, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, building the case that would see a corrupt minister hang for his crimes. And Silas prepared to leave. Margaret found him at the stable, saddling a new horse that Hayes had given him to replace the one that had died on the trail. "You are leaving." "I am." Without saying goodbye, Silas tightened the saddle cinch, not looking at her. "I am not good at goodbyes." "You are not good at staying either." That made him stop. He turned to face her, and for a moment the walls he had built around himself seemed to thin. "I have nothing to offer you," he said. "A cabin in the wilderness. A life of isolation. I am 52 years old, and I have more past than future." "That is not true." "How would you know?" "Because I have seen you, Silas Thornwood. I have seen who you are when you think no one is watching, when you sat by my bed through the fever, when you fought to protect a stranger, when you risked your life to race across the mountains." She stepped closer. "The best of you is not gone. It was just sleeping. And maybe it is time for it to wake up." They stood facing each other in the dim stable, the sounds of the city muffled by the wooden walls. "I need time," Margaret said. "Time to think, to pray, to understand what I want. But I will come to you. When the spring thaws the passes, I will come. And if you change your mind, I will not." Silas studied her face, searching for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that she was speaking from gratitude rather than something deeper. He found none. "I will wait," he said. She reached out and touched his face, a gesture so simple and yet so profound that it said more than 1,000 words. "Thank you," she said, "for saving my life, for giving me a chance to choose my own future." Then she stepped back, and Silas mounted his horse. He rode out of Denver as the sun was setting, heading west toward the mountains that had been his home and his prison for so long. Behind him, he left the noise and chaos of civilization. Ahead lay the silence he knew so well. But for the first time in 15 years, the silence did not feel like emptiness. It felt like anticipation. The trial of Reverend Josiah Crane lasted 5 days. Witnesses paraded through the courtroom, telling stories of disappeared loved ones in suspicious circumstances. The papers found on his men were entered into evidence, along with additional documents discovered in his church, revealing a pattern of kidnapping and extortion stretching back nearly a decade. Margaret testified on the second day. She stood tall before the court, her voice steady, as she recounted the attack on the wagon, the murder of Sister Agnes, her desperate flight through the wilderness. She described Crane's visits to the convent, his careful questions about her travel plans, the way he had positioned himself to exploit her father's trust. When she stepped down from the witness stand, she met Crane's eyes for the first and only time. He stared at her with naked hatred, the mask of the pious minister completely gone, now replaced by the face of the predator he had always been. Margaret did not flinch. She held his gaze until he looked away. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Judge Hayes, who had recused himself from the case due to personal involvement, watched from the gallery as his former friend was sentenced to hang. Deputy Webb received a lesser sentence, 10 years in territorial prison for conspiracy with the possibility of parole for good behavior. He wept when the verdict was read, not from fear of punishment, but from the relief of confession. On the morning of the execution, Margaret did not attend. She had seen enough of death. Instead, she stood at the window of her father's house and watched the sun rise over the mountains. Somewhere beyond those peaks in a valley she had never seen, a man was waiting. The question was whether she would go to him. Margaret spent the remaining weeks of winter in contemplation. She returned to the convent for a time, seeking the familiar rhythms of prayer and service. The sisters welcomed her back with joy, grateful for her survival, eager to absorb her into the community once more. But something had changed. The quiet peace that had once sustained her now felt like stagnation. The walls that had once protected her now felt like a tyranny. She found herself staring out windows, watching the mountains, thinking about a cabin she had never seen, and a man who had shown her a different kind of strength. Mother Superior noticed. The old nun had known Margaret since childhood, had watched her grow from an awkward, oversized girl into a woman of unusual capability and deep faith. "You are restless," Mother Superior said one evening as they walked the convent garden. "I am confused." "About what?" Margaret was silent for a long moment. "About where I belong. About what God wants from me." "Tell me, child, what do you feel when you pray?" "I feel like I am asking for permission. Permission to want something I have never let myself want before." "And what is that?" Margaret stopped walking. She looked up at the mountains painted gold by the setting sun. "A home. Not a convent or a shelter or a place to hide. A real home with someone who sees me as I am and values what he sees." Mother Superior was quiet for a time. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "Margaret, I have watched you serve this community for 8 years. You have nursed the sick, comforted the dying, taught the children. You have given everything of yourself, asking nothing in return." She placed a hand on Margaret's arm. "But service without joy becomes a burden. Faith without love becomes mere obligation. If your heart is calling you elsewhere, perhaps it is time to listen." "But my vows—" "Your vows are between you and God, not between you and these walls." Mother Superior smiled. "I have seen how you speak of this mountain man. There is light in your eyes that I have not seen in years. Perhaps that light is the answer to your prayers." The cabin looked different when Silas returned, smaller somehow after the chaos of Denver and the crowds of men he had traveled with, but also warmer, more like a home and less like a hiding place. He spent the first week recovering from the ordeal. His shoulder wound, aggravated by the desperate ride across the mountains, needed proper care. He slept long hours, ate the preserved meat and dried vegetables he had stored for winter, let his body heal. But his mind would not rest. He found himself looking at the cabin with new eyes, noticing how cramped it was, how sparse. One bed barely large enough for him, one chair by the fire, a table built for solitary meals. Everything designed for a man who expected to be alone forever. On the 8th day, Silas picked up his axe and went into the forest. He felled trees through the coldest months of winter, working until his muscles screamed and his breath came in ragged gasps. He stripped bark and shaped logs, fitted joints, and raised beams. By February, the skeleton of a new room stood beside the original cabin. By March, it had walls and a roof and a floor of smooth planked pine. He built a second bed larger than the first. He built a second chair. He expanded the table so 2 people could share a meal without their elbows touching. He built these things without knowing if anyone would ever use them. He built them as an act of faith, a declaration of hope, a way of telling the universe that he was ready to believe again. And when the work was done, when the new room stood solid and waiting, he sat on his porch and watched the eastern pass for signs of movement. The passes opened in late April when the snow finally released its grip on the high country and water ran free down the mountain slopes. Margaret left the convent on a cool morning, carrying a small bag of belongings and a heart full of uncertain hope. Her father rode with her to the edge of the wilderness, unwilling to let her make the journey entirely alone. They stopped where the road ended and the mountain trails began. "You are certain about this?" Hayes asked. Margaret looked at the peaks rising before her. "No, I am not certain about anything. But I need to find out on. He is a good man. I misjudged him badly." "We all did. Except he never misjudged himself. He knew exactly who he was and what he was capable of." She turned to her father. "That is rare. Most people spend their whole lives never knowing their true nature." Hayes nodded slowly. He reached out and took his daughter's hand, something he had not done since she was a child. "I was not a good father to you. I wanted you to be something you were not. I made you feel like a disappointment when you were anything but. Father, let me finish." His voice was thick with emotion. "Your mother died giving birth to you. For years I carried bitterness about that, and I took it out on you in ways I did not even recognize." He squeezed her hand. "You deserve better. You deserve happiness. And if this man can give you that, then you have my blessing. I will visit when the passes are clear. I want to know my daughter again." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She had waited 30 years to hear those words. "Thank you, Father." They embraced there on the mountain road, two people finally breaking through the walls they had built between each other. Then Margaret mounted her horse and rode into the wilderness toward whatever future awaited her in the valley beyond the peaks. Silas saw her from a mile away. He had been watching the eastern pass every day since the snows began to melt, scanning the trail for any sign of movement. When the dark shape appeared against the pale rock, his heart began to pound, in a way it had not since he was a young man. He walked out onto the porch of his expanded cabin and waited. She rode into the valley as the afternoon sun painted everything gold. She was not wearing her nun's habit. Instead, she wore practical frontier clothes, sturdy pants and a flannel shirt and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her face. She looked like a woman ready to work, ready to build, ready to begin again. She reined her horse to a stop 20 feet from the porch. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. "You came," Silas said. "I said I would. People say many things." Margaret dismounted and walked toward him. She stopped at the base of the porch steps, looking up at him with those gray-blue eyes that had haunted his dreams all winter. "I prayed about this," she said. "Every day for 3 months. I asked God to show me where I belonged." "And what did he say?" "Nothing. He never speaks to me in words." She smiled slightly. "But every time I closed my eyes, I saw your face. Every time I imagined my future, you were in it. That is as close to an answer as I have ever received." Silas descended the steps until he stood before her. She was taller than him by several inches. It did not matter. "I built you a room," he said. "A bed, a chair, a place at the table. I built them before I knew if you were coming." "Why bowing?" "Because for the first time in 15 years, I wanted to believe in something. I wanted to believe that mercy could be rewarded, that choosing to help a stranger could lead to something other than pain." He reached out and took her hand. "I wanted to believe in you." Margaret looked at their joined hands, his scarred and weathered, hers, large and strong. "I am not easy," she warned. "I speak my mind. I do not back down from arguments. I will not become someone's quiet, obedient wife. I do not want quiet or obedient. I want someone who will challenge me, who will stand beside me, who will tell me when I am being a fool." "You may regret that." I have regretted many things in my life. I do not think this will be one of them." She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. "Then show me my room, Silas Thornwood, and let us see what we can build together." They were married in the valley on a summer morning with Spotted Owl as their only witness. It was not a church wedding, but Margaret said prayers, and Silas added his own silent promises, and that was enough. Judge Hayes visited that autumn, making the difficult journey through the passes to see his daughter in her new home. He stayed for 2 weeks getting to know the man who had saved Margaret's life, beginning to rebuild the relationship he had neglected for so many years. He returned every year after that until his health no longer permitted the journey, and when he died peacefully in Denver at the age of 78, Margaret was at his bedside. The first years of marriage were hard. Silas and Margaret learned each other's rhythms, discovered each other's flaws, fought and reconciled, and grew closer through every challenge. Margaret was indeed not easy, and Silas was stubborn in ways that sometimes infuriated her. But beneath the friction was a bedrock of respect and understanding that only deepened with time. They built the cabin larger adding rooms as they were needed. They raised livestock and grew vegetables in the short mountain summers. They learned to read each other's silences to communicate in glances and touches as much as words. And then the children started coming. Not their own. Margaret could not bear children, a fact that had pained her in her younger years, but now seemed like providence. Instead, the children came from the outside world brought by fate and circumstance, and the spreading word of a couple in the mountains who would take in those with nowhere else to go. The first was a boy of 7 orphaned when his parents' wagon went off a cliff. A rancher brought him to the valley after hearing about the strange couple who lived there, the tall woman and the quiet man who had once been a hermit. The second was a girl of 5 found wandering the roads after her family died of influenza. The third and fourth came together, siblings whose father had been killed in a mining accident and whose mother had died of grief. Over the years, 12 children passed through the cabin in the valley. Some stayed only months before relatives claimed them. Others remained for years. 3 stayed forever, growing to adulthood in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, inheriting the legacy of 2 people who had learned that love multiplies rather than divides. Margaret taught them to read and write, to pray and question, to stand tall no matter what the world thought of them. Silas taught them to survive, to track and hunt and build, to find peace in silence and strength in stillness. Together, they taught them that family is not always blood, that home is not always where you were born, that the most powerful force in the world is the choice to love someone when you could have walked away. The stars had shifted in their courses. Hours had passed while Silas told his story, and now the night was deep and silent around the cabin. Thomas sat motionless, his face wet with tears he had not noticed shedding. "That is how it happened," Silas said. "That is how I found your grandmother and how we built this life together." 52 years, Thomas whispered. 52 years, and I would not change a single day. The cabin door opened and a figure emerged onto the porch. Margaret, 74 years old, but still tall and strong, still carrying herself with the quiet authority that had never diminished. "You boys have been talking half the night," she said. "Thomas, you need sleep. You have a train to catch in the morning." "I know, Grandma." Thomas stood, stretching, muscles cramped from sitting still so long. Grandpa was telling me how you met." Margaret looked at her husband, one eyebrow raised. "Did he tell you the part where he almost died of infection because he was too stubborn to rest properly?" "He mentioned it was bad. It was worse than bad. I spent the first month of our marriage nursing him back from the edge of the grave. He tried to build a barn while he still had fever." She shook her head, but her eyes were soft. "Stubborn man." "You married me anyway." "I did. God knows why." They smiled at each other, the old familiar smile of 2 people who had weathered half a century together and would not trade a moment of it. Thomas watched them, and something clicked into place in his heart. All his fears about leaving, about losing himself, about becoming someone he did not recognize. They seemed smaller now, less overwhelming. "Grandpa," he said, "you said you wanted to teach me how to keep from getting lost out there in the world." "I did, but you never actually told me how." Silas looked at his grandson, this young man on the threshold of his own life, and smiled. "You were not listening closely enough. I told you the whole time." "What do you mean?" "The answer is not to hold on to who you were. The answer is to choose who you become." Silas reached out and put a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "When I found your grandmother in the snow, I had a choice. I could walk away and stay the man I had been for 15 years, bitter and alone and hiding from the world. Or I could help her and become someone new. And you chose to help her. I chose to be the man I wanted to be instead of the man I had let myself become. That is the secret, Thomas. You will face 1,000 choices out there in the world. Easy choices and hard ones. Moments when no one is watching and you could take the selfish path without consequences." Silas squeezed his shoulder. "In those moments, remember who you want to be. Choose that man, and you will never be lost." Thomas was silent for a long moment. Then he embraced his grandfather, holding tight to the old man who had been a pillar of his world for as long as he could remember. "I will remember," he said. "I promise." "Good." Silas patted his back. Now go to bed. You have a long journey tomorrow. Dawn broke over the Rocky Mountains in shades of pink and gold. Thomas stood on the porch with his single bag watching the light creep down the peaks into the valley below. His grandfather and grandmother stood with him. Behind them, the cabin was already alive with the sounds of waking family, the next generation beginning another day in the home that two people had built from nothing but hope and determination. "Write to us," Margaret said, "every week if you can." "I will, Grandma. And eat properly. Those city restaurants will try to feed you garbage. Find a place that cooks real food." "Yes, Grandma." She pulled him into a fierce embrace, this woman who had never let her unusual size make her feel small, who had taught him that strength comes in many forms. "You are going to do wonderful things," she whispered. "I know it." Then it was Silas's turn. The old man did not embrace his grandson. Instead, he extended his hand, and they shook as equals. "You have good roots," Silas said. "Remember them when the winds blow hard." "I will." "Oh. And remember that this valley is always here. No matter what happens out there, no matter how far you travel, or how long you are gone, this is your home, and we will always be waiting." Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. He mounted the horse that would take him to the train station, turned for one last look at the cabin and the old couple standing before it, and raised his hand in farewell. They raised theirs in return. Then Thomas rode east toward the rising sun and the future that awaited him. Behind him, the valley settled back into its ancient peace, keeping its secrets, holding its memories, waiting patiently for his return. Silas and Margaret lived another 8 years after that morning. Silas died first quietly in his sleep at the age of 82. Margaret found him peaceful in their bed, a slight smile on his weathered face, as if his final dream had been a pleasant one. She buried him on this ridge overlooking the valley, the place where she had stood all those years ago, when she revealed herself to her father and ended Crane's schemes. Margaret followed him 14 months later. She went surrounded by children and grandchildren, the vast family that had grown from two lost souls who found each other in the wilderness. Her last words were to Thomas, who had become a successful attorney in Chicago and had traveled home the moment he heard she was failing. "Your grandfather was wrong about one thing." She whispered, her voice thin but steady. "He said the best of him died in that fire in Missouri, but the best of him lived. It lived in every child we raised, in every life we touched, in you." She squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "That is the real reward, Thomas. Not land or money or recognition. The real reward is the love you leave behind." She was buried beside Silas on the ridge where the sun rose over the mountains every morning and set behind the peaks every night. The cabin still stands today. Thomas's children inherited it and their children after them. Each generation has added rooms, expanded the structures, modernized what needed modernizing while preserving the heart of the original building. But in the oldest part of the house, in the room that was once the entire cabin, nothing has changed. The stone fireplace still warms the space on cold winter nights. The rough-hewn beams still hold up the ceiling. And on the wall, protected behind glass, hang 3 photographs: a young woman with gentle eyes and 2 small children. And beside them, a newer photograph of a tall woman and a weathered man standing together in front of their mountain home. The plaque beneath them reads simply, "Silas Thornwood and Margaret Hayes Thornwood, who prove that mercy is never wasted and love can bloom in the most unlikely places." The mountain man found a woman dying in the snow. He could have walked away. He could have remained the bitter, isolated man he had been for 15 years. Instead, he chose mercy. He chose courage. He chose love. And that choice changed everything. Not just for him, not just for her, but for generations to come, rippling outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water, touching lives that would never know the full story of how it all began. That is the power of a single act of kindness. That is the legacy of the mountain man and the fallen nun. That is the reward that mattered most.